The snow fell thick that night in Montana, 1887. Each flake landed silent as a whisper on the empty road that wound through Cedar Valley. Ruth Marin pulled her threadbare shawl tighter, though it did little against the December wind that cut through the fabric like a blade through paper. Her boots had given up 3 miles back. Now she walked on feet wrapped in strips torn from her petticoat, the snow burning through the thin cloth with each step. She'd been walking since dawn. When the station master at Copper Creek had told her there was no work for her kind, whatever kind that was. She hadn't asked. She'd learned not to ask questions that might invite longer explanations. The road stretched ahead, disappearing into the white darkness. Ruth knew she should find shelter soon. Folks died on nights like this, frozen stiff by morning, discovered by travelers who'd shake their heads and mutter about foolish women traveling alone. But there was nowhere to stop. No barn or abandoned shack in sight. Just the endless Montana snow and the weight of exhaustion pulling at her bones. Then she saw it, a faint glow through the curtain of falling snow. A lamp in a window, barely visible through the storm. It flickered like a star that couldn't decide whether to shine or go out. The house sat at the end of the valley, small and sturdy, built from logs that had weathered more winters than Ruth had lived through. Smoke rose from the chimney, straight up in the still air before the wind caught it and tore it to pieces. Ruth stopped at the gate, her hands gripping the rough wood. The house looked lived in but lonesome, the kind of place where silence had settled into the walls. A barn stood off to the side, and she could hear horses shifting in their stalls, probably restless from the storm. Everything about the place spoke of order, of someone who kept things running even when there was no one to notice. She stood there long enough for snow to pile on her shoulders. Her teeth chattered so hard she feared they might crack, but still she hesitated. She'd knocked on too many doors these past months, had seen too many faces harden at the sight of her. Some folks were kind enough to offer a meal, but their kindness always came with questions. Where was her husband? Why was she traveling alone? What kind of woman wandered the territories with nothing but the clothes on her back? The cold made the decision for her. She pushed through the gate, each step deliberate despite her shaking legs. The porch boards creaked under her weight, what little weight she had left after weeks of going hungry more often than not. She raised her hand to knock, then lowered it, raised it again. Before her knuckles could touch wood, the door opened. The man who stood there was tall in the way of men who'd learned to fill doorways, not from size, but from presence. His hair was dark with early silver at the temples, and his face bore the weathered look of someone who'd spent more time with cattle and weather than with people. He wore a flannel shirt, sleeves rolled up despite the cold, and his hands were clean but work-worn. He held a coffee cup in one hand, steam rising between them like a barrier. They looked at each other across the threshold. Ruth waited for the questions, the suspicion, the slow closing of the door. Instead, the man stepped back, opening the door wider. "Cold night to be walking," he said. His voice was quiet, rusty from disuse. Ruth nodded, not trusting her voice. Her throat felt frozen shut. The man studied her with eyes the color of winter sky, not blue exactly, but that gray that comes before snow. Whatever he saw in her face made him nod once, decisive. "I won't ask where you've come from," he said. "Just need to know you're not bringing trouble to my door." Ruth found her voice, though it came out cracked as old leather. "No trouble, Mr. Just looking for—" She stopped. What was she looking for? Work shelter, a place to die out of the wind, just passing through. In this weather, he didn't smile, but something in his expression softened a fraction. "Best pass through in the morning. Kitchen's warm." He turned and walked back into the house, leaving the door open. Ruth understood it was as much invitation as she'd get. She stepped inside, careful not to track too much snow, though her efforts were mostly useless. Her feet left wet prints on the clean floorboards. The kitchen was simple but clean, everything in its place. A cast iron stove radiated heat that hit Ruth like a physical thing. making her skin prickle and ache as feeling returned. The man gestured to a chair near the stove. "Sit before you fall." Ruth sat, her legs giving out the moment she had permission. The man moved around the kitchen with the easy efficiency of someone long accustomed to doing for himself. He set a cup of coffee in front of her without asking if she wanted it. The cup burned her frozen fingers, but she held on anyway, letting the pain remind her she was still alive. "There's stew," he said, already ladling some into a bowl. "Nothing fancy. Beef and potatoes mainly." "I can work for it," Ruth said quickly. "I don't take charity." The man set the bowl in front of her. "Eat first. We'll sort the rest after." The stew was simple as promised, but to Ruth it might as well have been a feast. She tried to eat slowly, with dignity, but hunger won. She emptied the bowl while the man sat across from her, nursing his coffee and staring at something beyond the kitchen window. "Name's Caleb Rowan," he said finally. "This is my place. Run cattle mostly, some horses." "Ruth Marin," she offered in return, then wondered if she should have given a false name. Too late now. Caleb nodded like her name was just another fact, like the snow outside or the coffee in his cup. "There's a room off the kitchen. Used to be for—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "It's empty now. Has a cot and blankets. You can stay there tonight. Door locks from the inside if that matters." It did matter, and his understanding of that said more than any questions might have. "Thank you," Ruth said, meaning it down to her bones. Caleb stood, took her empty bowl to the sink. "I'm up before dawn. If you're still here, there's work needs doing. If you're gone, well," he shrugged. "That's your choice." He left then, disappearing down a hallway into the deeper darkness of the house. Ruth heard a door close, then silence except for the wind outside and the settling of the fire in the stove. She found the room he'd mentioned, small but clean like everything else. The cot was narrow but had good blankets and, true to his word. The door had a solid lock. Ruth turned it, then sat on the cot, still wearing her wet clothes because she had nothing else. For the first time in weeks, she was warm, fed, safe behind a locked door. She should have been grateful, should have felt relief. Instead, she found herself crying silent tears that came from some deep place she'd thought frozen solid. She pressed her face into the pillow to muffle any sound. The man Caleb had offered her dignity along with shelter. The least she could do was accept both with grace. Outside, the snow continued to fall. The lamp in the window burned steady through the night, a small defiance against the darkness. And somewhere in the house, Caleb Rowan lay awake, wondering what kind of hurt had driven a woman to walk through a Montana blizzard with nothing but determination and worn-out boots. He'd meant what he said he wouldn't ask about yesterday. He'd learned the hard way that sometimes the past was better left buried under snow and silence. But he'd also noticed things, the way she'd held herself despite exhaustion, the pride that kept her spine straight even as her legs shook, the careful way she'd eaten, like someone who'd learned not to count on the next meal. Come morning, he'd see if she stayed or went. Either way, he'd done what needed doing. His May would have opened the door too, would have set out food and pointed to the warm spot by the stove. It was a small comfort, thinking May would approve. The wind howled around the corners of the house, but inside, 2 people slept. One locked behind a door, finally safe. The other listening to the familiar sounds of his empty house, now holding one more soul seeking shelter from the storm. The lamp burned on, steady as a promise, waiting for morning to reveal what choices the night had brought to this quiet valley where yesterday's sorrows could rest, at least for a while. Under Montana snow. Ruth woke to gray light filtering through the small window. For a moment, she didn't know where she was, only that she was warm, and the familiar ache of cold had left her bones. Then memory returned the snow, the lamp in the window, the quiet man who'd opened his door without asking questions. She dressed quickly in her still damp clothes, finger-combed her dark hair into something resembling order, and unlocked the door. The kitchen was empty, but the stove had been fed recently, she could tell by the fresh heat radiating from it. On the table sat a piece of paper, weighted down by a tin cup. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. If you want to stay a few days, you can just need honest work. Coffee's hot. C.R. Ruth read it twice, then folded the paper carefully and placed it in her pocket. She'd kept every scrap of kindness shown to her these past months, a handful of notes. A pressed flower from a child in Nebraska. A brass button given by an old woman at a stage stop. Small things that reminded her the world hadn't gone entirely cold. She found the coffee and poured herself a cup, then looked around the kitchen with different eyes. Yesterday she'd been too exhausted and grateful to notice details. Now she saw what needed doing. Dishes from last night waited by the sink. The floor, despite Caleb's evident efforts, showed the wear of a man living alone, clean but not deep clean. The windows were hazed with old smoke and cooking grease. Ruth had been in service once, years ago, before everything changed. She knew how to make a house shine, how to move through rooms like a ghost, leaving only order in her wake. She rolled up her sleeves and set to work. By the time Caleb returned from the barn, the kitchen gleamed. The windows caught the weak winter sun and threw it across floors that had been scrubbed to show the wood grain. The stove was blacked, the copper bottom of the one good pot polished to a shine. Ruth had even found time to start a pot of beans soaking for dinner. Caleb stopped in the doorway, taking it in. His expression didn't change much. Ruth was learning that about him, how he kept his thoughts locked away like valuables in a safe. But something in his shoulders eased. "Didn't expect all this," he said finally. "Said you needed honest work." Ruth kept her voice steady, businesslike. "This is what I know how to do." He nodded, hung his coat on the peg by the door. "There's more if you're willing, plenty more." That became their pattern. Caleb would leave her lists never demanding, always framed as suggestions. "Pantry could use organizing if you have time," or "spare room hasn't been touched in a while." Ruth attacked each task like it was a gift, which in a way it was. Work meant purpose. Purpose meant a reason to stay another day. She started with the main house, working her way through rooms that told the story of a life interrupted. The parlor with its good furniture covered in dust sheets. The dining room where one place setting had worn a pale spot in the table's finish. Everything spoke of a house that had once held more life than it did now. In the kitchen pantry, she found preserves with labels in a woman's careful script. Strawberry, June 1883, and apple butter, May's recipe. Ruth arranged them with the oldest in front, though she suspected Caleb hadn't touched them in years. Some griefs were too heavy to be opened with a spoon. The spare room Caleb had mentioned was thick with dust and neglect. Boxes stacked in corners. Furniture pushed against walls. Ruth cleaned around them at first, not wanting to pry. But when she found mice had gotten into a box of linens, she had no choice but to sort through everything. Most of it was ordinary extra blankets, old clothes that might be cut down for rags, the accumulated debris of any household. But in one trunk, wrapped in tissue paper gone yellow with age, she found a woman's dress, navy blue wool, good quality, with covered buttons and careful stitching, the kind of dress a woman wore to church or to town on special occasions. Ruth held it up to the light, seeing the care that had gone into its making. Then she wrapped it back in its tissue paper, placed it gently in the trunk, and pushed the trunk back into its corner. Some things weren't hers to disturb. Days passed in this careful dance of work and silence. Caleb left early, came back late, always with evidence of hard work on his clothes and in the tired set of his shoulders. Ruth kept the house, made meals from what she found in the pantry and root cellar, and learned the rhythm of this quiet life. They ate dinner together, usually in silence, broken only by requests to pass the salt or comments about the weather. Ruth discovered Caleb liked his coffee black and strong enough to float a horseshoe. that he had a weakness for biscuits if she made them right, and that he always paused before entering a room, like he was still expecting to find someone there. She learned other things too. He was fair-minded, leaving money on the table each week, wages. He called it, though it wasn't much. He noticed everything but commented on little. When she mended a tear in one of his shirts, he simply nodded. When she organized his tools in the barn, he said that's better and nothing more. But she also saw the small kindnesses. An extra armload of wood appeared by the stove on particularly cold mornings. A wool blanket heavy and warm showed up on her cot one day. No explanation given. When she mentioned the hinge on the pantry door squeaked, it was oiled by the next evening. One night, about 2 weeks into her stay, the temperature dropped so low the windows frosted over on the inside. Ruth kept the stove fed, but cold crept through the walls like a living thing. She was adding another stick to the fire when Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Pipes'll freeze if this keeps up," he said. "Need to keep water dripping through the night." They worked together, setting pans under taps, wrapping exposed pipes with old rags. It was the most they'd been in each other's company since that first night. Ruth noticed he was careful to maintain distance, never crowding her in the small spaces. She noticed, too, the competent way he handled tasks, like a man long used to managing alone. When they finished, Caleb made coffee his solution to most problems. Ruth had learned. They sat at the kitchen table, listening to the wind test the windows. "Had a freeze like this the first winter here," he said suddenly. "May and I thought we'd lose everything. Pipes burst in 3 places. Lost half the chickens. Had to burn furniture to keep warm when the wood ran out." It was the first time he'd volunteered anything about the past. Ruth held still, afraid that any movement might stop the flow of words. She never complained. Caleb continued, staring into his coffee. "Just set her jaw and got on with it. Tough as any man, tougher than most." He took a sip. "Would have liked this cold even less now, though always felt it more after." He stopped, shook his head like he was clearing cobwebs. "Anyway, should be warmer by week's end." Ruth understood dismissal when she heard it. She finished her coffee, bid him good night, and returned to her room. But she lay awake thinking about May, who'd been tough enough to survive that first winter but not what came after. She thought about the preserves in the pantry, the dress in the trunk, the careful script on the labels, a life interrupted, frozen in time like the frost on the windows. The next morning, she found Caleb had been right, the pipes had made it through the night. But she also found something else. On the kitchen table, beside her usual wages, lay a pair of sturdy boots, women's boots, barely worn, the kind made for hard winters and long walks. The note beside them was brief. "These are no use sitting in storage. C.R.R." Ruth picked up the boots, tested the leather. They were well made, practical, the kind of gift that said someone had been paying attention to her worn footwear but was too polite to mention it directly. She tried them on. They fit as if made for her. When Caleb came in for breakfast, she was wearing them. He glanced down once, nodded like something had been confirmed, and sat down to his eggs and biscuits without comment. "Thank you," Ruth said quietly. "Nothing to thank me for," Caleb replied. "Just good sense, keeping useful things in use." But Ruth saw the way he almost smiled, just a slight easing around his eyes before he turned his attention to breakfast. And she understood that in this house of carefully maintained silence, even small gestures carried weight. That night, the cold broke, the wind died down, and stars appeared through gaps in the clouds. Ruth stood at the kitchen window, washing the dinner dishes, watching the moon paint the snow-covered valley in shades of silver and shadow. Behind her, Caleb worked on repairing a piece of harness, the leather creaking softly as he handled it. It was peaceful, this shared quiet, the kind of peace Ruth hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. She knew it couldn't last, nothing good in her life ever had. But for now, for tonight, She had warm boots on her feet, honest work for her hands, and a quiet kitchen where yesterday's sorrows could rest undisturbed. Outside, the lamp in the window burned on, steady as breathing, keeping watch over the Montana night. The mantel above the fireplace had been Ruth's project for the morning. Weeks of accumulated dust had turned everything gray. The clock that no longer kept time, the pair of candlesticks, and several small objects she couldn't quite make out until she lifted them carefully, one by one. That's when she found it a small pottery jar, no bigger than her fist, glazed in blue with darker blue flowers painted around its middle. It was beautiful in its simplicity, the kind of thing a woman might keep on her dresser for pins or small treasures. But it was the inscription that made Ruth pause. Carved into the bottom in careful letters, "For May." She held the jar in her hands, feeling the weight of it, not just the clay, but the meaning. This wasn't some store-bought trinket. Someone had made this, shaped it with patient hands, painted those delicate flowers, carved that inscription. It spoke of time taken, of love given form. Ruth cleaned it carefully and set it back exactly where she'd found it, centered on the mantel like it was meant to be. She cleaned around it, under it, but never moved it again. Some things, she was learning, were anchors. They held a house to its memories, kept it from floating away entirely into the present. The clock got the same careful treatment, though its hands stayed frozen at 20 minutes past 2. The candlestick's silver plate worn through to brass in spots gleamed when she finished, but the pottery jar drew the eye, sitting there with its quiet inscription, holding whatever secrets it had been trusted with. Later, carrying cleaning supplies down the hallway, Ruth noticed the door again. She'd passed it dozens of times now, always closed, with a particular stillness that set it apart from the other rooms. Caleb had called it the old room that first week when she'd asked about cleaning the whole house. Not that one, he'd said, and something in his voice had made it clear the subject wasn't open for discussion. But Ruth found herself pausing there each time she passed. Not from curiosity, she'd learned better than to pry into other people's sealed doors. It was something else, a feeling like the air was thicker there, weighted with what lay behind that simple pine door. She never touched the handle, never even reached for it, but she always slowed her steps, sometimes holding her breath without meaning to. The house had other mysteries, a height chart penciled on the kitchen door frame, marking someone's growth up to about 4 feet, then stopping, a set of small books on a high shelf, their spines too faded to read, a rag doll tucked behind preserves in the pantry, like someone had set it down for just a moment and forgotten to come back. Ruth left them all where she found them. She was a custodian, not an excavator. Her job was to clean around the memories, not disturb them. One afternoon, while Caleb was out checking the fence lines, Ruth tackled the parlor. It was clearly the least used room, everything covered in sheets like ghosts of furniture. She worked methodically, removing each sheet, cleaning beneath, then covering things back up. The good horsehair sofa, the matching chairs, the small table with its lace doily all waiting for company that never came. In the corner stood a whatnot shelf, its contents obscured by dust and shadow. Ruth cleaned each shelf carefully, finding the expected collection of oddments, a few decorative plates, a carved wooden bird, a small framed piece of embroidery. But on the bottom shelf, pushed to the back, she discovered a leather photograph album. She shouldn't have opened it. She knew that even as her fingers found the cover, even as she sat on the sheet-covered sofa and placed the album in her lap. But houses told their stories whether you wanted to hear them or not, and sometimes the stories helped you understand the silences better. The first pages held what she expected: formal portraits of people in their Sunday best, the kind taken at traveling photographers' studios. Some were labeled in that same careful script from the preserved jars: Mother and Father Rowan, 1876, May's family, Nebraska. Wedding day, May 15th, 1880. Ruth studied the wedding portrait. Caleb looked younger, but essentially the same: serious, steady, with those winter sky eyes looking directly at the camera. But May was radiant. Not beautiful in the conventional sense, but glowing with the kind of joy that made beauty irrelevant. She was small, barely reaching Caleb's shoulder, with dark hair piled high and a smile that suggested she knew wonderful secrets. The pages that followed showed the progression of a life. May in the garden they'd started. Caleb with a new horse. The two of them standing before the house when it was newly built. Raw lumber not yet weathered to its current silver gray. And then Ruth turned the page and her breath caught. A child. A little girl with May's dark hair and Caleb's serious expression, though a smile played at the corners of her mouth like she was trying not to laugh at something. She appeared in photograph after photograph in a white christening gown, taking first steps in the yard, sitting on Caleb's shoulders with her arms spread wide like she could embrace the whole valley. The last photograph showed all three of them. The girl would have been about 4, Ruth guessed, wearing a dark dress with a white collar. She stood between her parents, one small hand in each of theirs. May wasn't looking at the camera this time. She was gazing down at her daughter with an expression of such tender pride that Ruth felt like an intruder witnessing it. After that, blank pages, nothing but black paper and empty corners where photographs should have been. Ruth closed the album carefully and returned it to its hiding place. She understood now why the height chart stopped at 4 feet. Why there were children's books but no child. Why a pottery jar inscribed for May sat on the mantel like a monument. She finished cleaning the parlor in silence, covering each piece of furniture with the same care she imagined May might have used. When Caleb returned that evening, she had supper-ready beef stew again, but with fresh bread she'd managed from the last of the good flour. He ate quietly, as usual, but Ruth noticed he looked tired. More than tired, worn, like something was pulling at him from the inside. She almost spoke, almost said something about the photographs, but caught herself. He hadn't asked her about her yesterday's. She wouldn't ask about his. Instead, she cleared the table and brought coffee. When she set his cup down, Caleb looked up at her. For a moment, their eyes met and held. Ruth saw the weight he carried, the careful way he held himself together. He saw. She didn't know what he saw, but his expression softened slightly. "The house looks good," he said. "Better than it has in years." "It's a good house," Ruth replied. "Well built, just needed some attention." May would have. He stopped, cleared his throat. "She kept it nice, had a way of making things feel lived in." He took a sip of coffee, seemed to consider his words. "Not like a museum, like a home." Ruth sat down across from him, cradling her own cup. "The preserves in the pantry, strawberry, apple butter, were those hers?" Caleb nodded. "Couldn't bring myself to eat them. Couldn't throw them out either. Foolish, probably." "Not foolish," Ruth said softly. "Sometimes keeping things is all we can do." He looked at her sharply then, like he was seeing her for the first time. "You lost people too." It wasn't a question. Ruth nodded, but didn't elaborate. After a moment, Caleb went back to his coffee. "The girl," he said suddenly. "Elsie, scarlet fever, winter of '84. Doctor said there was nothing. May never got over it, tried to carry on. But something in her just gave up. Found her in the snow behind the barn 2 winters later. Said she was going to check the chickens." The words came out flat, matter of fact, like he was reporting the weather. But Ruth heard what lay beneath them, years of asking why, of wondering what he could have done different, of waking up to a house too quiet and too empty. "I'm sorry," she said, because what else was there to say? Caleb shrugged. "Long time ago now, life goes on." But they both knew that wasn't quite true. Life went on. Yes, but it went on changed. It went on with closed doors and covered furniture, with preserves that would never be eaten and photographs that stopped at page 12. They sat in companionable silence until their coffee grew cold. Then Caleb stood, bid her good night, and headed for his room. Ruth washed the cups, banked the fire in the stove, and made her own way to bed. But first, she stopped at the mantel and touched the pottery jar gently. Just once. "For May," she whispered, like a prayer or a promise. Then she blew out the lamp and let darkness settle over the house. In her narrow room, Ruth lay thinking about the weight of memory, how it could fill a house until there was barely room for the living. She thought about May, who'd made preserves and kept chickens and loved a serious man and a laughing child. She thought about Elsie, frozen at 4 years old, never to ask for one more story or track mud through the kitchen or grow tall enough to add another mark to the doorframe. And she thought about Caleb, carrying on alone in this house full of ghosts, keeping faith with the dead by changing nothing, disturbing nothing, as if May might walk through the door any moment and want to find everything just as she'd left it. Ruth understood that kind of waiting. She had her own ghosts, her own doors better left closed, but she was beginning to wonder if there might be a different way, not forgetting. Never that, but maybe letting a little life back in around the edges of memory. Tomorrow, she decided, she'd bake a pie with some of those preserved apples in the cellar. Not May's preserves, those would stay where they were, but the ones from the back, the ones going soft. She'd make something warm and good, something that would fill the house with the smell of cinnamon and pastry. It wasn't much, but in a house this full of yesterday, even small gestures toward tomorrow felt like acts of courage. The tin box had been forgotten behind the barn, half buried under a pile of old lumber and rusted tools. Ruth found it while searching for soundboards to repair the chicken coop floor. The winter sun was weak, but warm enough to make the work pleasant, and she'd been humming to herself an old hymn her mother used to sing while hanging wash. She almost missed the box entirely. Would have if a corner hadn't caught the light just so. It was the kind of container people used for important papers or small valuables, though rust had claimed most of the surface. The lid was stuck fast. Ruth worked at it with patient fingers, not wanting to damage whatever might be inside. When it finally opened with a screech of protest, she found it lined with oilcloth, still intact despite the years. Inside were a few documents, a land deed, some receipts, and at the bottom, wrapped in what had once been white cotton, a photograph. Ruth lifted it carefully. The image was faded, but clear enough, a little girl standing beside Caleb in front of the barn. She wore a wool dress that looked handmade, sturdy boots, and an expression of such serious concentration that Ruth smiled despite herself. The girl Elsie. It had to be Elsie, held a barn cat in her arms, and the cat appeared to be tolerating this indignity with feline patience. But it was Caleb who made Ruth's throat tight. He was looking down at his daughter with such unguarded tenderness, such complete attention that it transformed his face entirely. This wasn't the careful, closed-off man who moved through the house like he was trying not to disturb the air. This was a father wholly present in a moment with his child. Ruth studied the photograph for a long time, memorizing the details, the way Elsie's dark hair escaped from her braids, the patch on the knee of her dress, how one of Caleb's hands rested protective on her small shoulder, the barn cat's resigned expression. All of it spoke of ordinary life, the kind of everyday moment that only becomes precious after it's gone. She rewrapped the photograph carefully and returned it to the tin box, then the box to its hiding place. Some discoveries weren't meant to be shared, but that evening, she couldn't help watching Caleb differently, seeing the ghost of that tender father overlaying the silent man across the dinner table. It was after supper, while she was mending one of his shirts by lamplight, that Caleb spoke unexpectedly. "Found fresh tracks by the chicken coop today. Fox, probably. Need to shore up that loose board before we lose any hens." "I'll see to it tomorrow," Ruth said, not mentioning she'd already started the repair. "Found some good wood behind the barn." Caleb nodded. Went back to his book, a farming almanac he'd probably read a dozen times. But a few minutes later, he spoke again. She loved those chickens. Elsie. Named everyone. Could tell them apart when they all looked the same to me. Used to collect the eggs in her apron. Careful, as if they were made of china. Ruth's hands stilled on the mending. She waited, hardly breathing. Had one hen, a Rhode Island red she called Penny. Meanest bird you ever saw. Pecked everyone except Elsie. That child would march right up to her, scold her for being unneighborly. And Penny would settle right down. Used to follow her around the yard like a dog. He was quiet for a moment, lost in the memory. Then he seemed to remember himself, cleared his throat, and returned to his almanac. But Ruth had heard the smile in his voice, seen the way his hands had relaxed on the book. "What happened to Penny?" she asked softly, taking a risk. "Lived to be ancient for a chicken. Died the summer after." He paused. "After, found her under her favorite bush, like she just decided it was time." Ruth went back to her sewing, but the silence between them felt different now, warmer, somehow, like sharing that small memory had eased something in the room. Over the next days, more small stories emerged, never forced, never more than Caleb could bear to tell. How Elsie had insisted on learning to milk the cow at age 3, needing a stepped stool to reach. How she'd tried to teach the barn cats to sing. How she'd planted sunflower seeds along the fence, declaring the farm needed more yellow. They grew taller than she was, Caleb said one evening, apropos of nothing. Those sunflowers, she'd stand underneath them like they were trees, making up stories about sunflower forests and the creatures that lived there. Ruth began to build a picture of this child from these fragments. Elsie emerged as serious but imaginative, tender with animals, determined to help with every farm task whether she was big enough or not. A child who named chickens and befriended ornery hens, who created magical worlds from sunflowers and barn cats. One afternoon, while organizing the storage room, Ruth found a small wooden crate filled with what could only be Elsie's treasures, smooth stones, probably collected from the creek, pressed flowers between pieces of glass, a bird's nest, carefully preserved, and at the bottom, a cloth doll with yarn hair and a stitched smile. Ruth lifted the doll gently. It was well loved. That was clear, the fabric soft from handling. One button eye hanging by a thread. She could fix it easily enough, restore it to something like new. But should she, or would that be erasing the very things that made it precious, the signs of a child's daily love? She was still considering when she heard Caleb's boots on the porch. Quickly, she returned the doll to its box, not wanting to be caught with what felt like trespassing. But when he entered, he must have seen something in her face. "You found her treasure box," he said. It wasn't accusatory, just observant. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to—" "It's all right." He moved past her to look down at the open crate. May kept meaning to make a proper memory box. Never got around to it. He picked up one of the stones, turned it in his fingers. "This was from the day we went fishing at Baker's Creek. Elsie spent more time collecting rocks than watching her line. Said they were magic stones. Each one had a wish inside." "Did she make wishes?" Ruth asked. "Everyone. Careful wishes, too. Nothing foolish. Wished for rain when we needed it. Wished for Penny to lay double yolk eggs. Wished for—" He set the stone back carefully. "Wished for a baby brother or sister." The pain in those last words was sharp enough to cut. Ruth felt it in her chest, an echo of old griefs. "The doll," she said quietly. "I could fix the eye if you'd like. Not change anything else. Just secure it better." Caleb was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then May made that. Spent evenings working on it while Elsie played at her feet. Christmas gift, that last year. He touched the doll's yarn hair gently. Maybe fixing the eye would be good. May would have hated seeing it come loose. That evening, Ruth sat by the fire with the doll in her lap, making tiny, careful stitches to secure the button eye. Caleb sat across from her, pretending to read but watching her work. When she finished, she held it up for his inspection. "Looks right," he said gruffly. Elsie would have appreciated that. Always particular about her dolls being properly dressed and minded, as she put it. Ruth smiled at that. She sounds like she was quite a character. She was May made small, Caleb said. All that fire and determination packed into someone who barely came up to my waist. Scared me sometimes. How much life was in that little body. Like she was trying to fit a lifetime into... He stopped, jaw working. Into 4 years, Ruth finished gently. Yeah. They sat with that truth between them. Outside, wind rattled the windows, but inside the fire crackled warm. Ruth placed the mended doll carefully on the table between them, where it smiled its stitched smile at nothing in particular. I had a son, Ruth said suddenly, surprising herself. Samuel, 3 years old when the fever took him. That was 6 years ago now. Caleb looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw recognition in his eyes, the fellowship of loss, the understanding that only comes from carrying a grief too large for words. I'm sorry, he said simply. He had a wooden horse, Ruth continued, not sure why she was talking, but unable to stop. Carried it everywhere. I kept it until I couldn't anymore. Left it buried under a tree in Kansas when I had to move on. She touched the doll's dress lightly. Sometimes I wish I still had it. Sometimes I'm glad I don't. Yeah, Caleb said again, and that single word carried more understanding than a dozen speeches might have. They sat in companionable silence after that. Two people who'd learned that love persists even when its object is gone. That memory can be both blessing and burden. The doll sat between them, button eyes gleaming in the firelight, holding the ghost of a little girl's love in its cloth body. When Ruth finally rose to go to bed, Caleb stood too. Thank you, he said, for fixing her doll, for... He gestured helplessly at something larger than words. Good night, Caleb, Ruth said softly, and used his given name for the first time. Good night, Ruth, he replied, and there was something different in how he said her name too. Not quite warmth yet, but the possibility of it. Ruth took the lamp and made her way to her room, leaving Caleb standing by the dying fire. In the morning, she knew they'd go back to their careful dance of work and silence. But tonight, they'd shared something real. Two grieving parents recognizing each other across the divide of loss. In her room, Ruth sat on her narrow bed and let herself remember Samuel for the first time in months. His laugh, the weight of him sleeping in her arms. His wooden horse, which he'd called Clip-Clop with the creativity of a 3-year-old. Somewhere in the house, she heard Caleb moving about, probably banking the fire and checking the doors. The sounds of a man ending his day, maintaining his routines in a house too empty but still standing. Tomorrow, she thought, she'd make something special for breakfast. Maybe those biscuits he liked, with apple butter, not maize, but from the newer jars. And maybe they'd talk more, or maybe they wouldn't. But either way, something had shifted tonight. The closed doors were still closed, the griefs still carried. But maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to carry them quite so alone. The stranger appeared on a Tuesday morning when the March wind was playing tricks with last winter's snow, swirling it into small devils that danced across the yard. Ruth was hanging wash, one of those necessary tasks that couldn't wait for better weather, when she spotted him at the fence line. He sat his horse like a man with nowhere particular to be, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the property with purpose. Ruth's hands stilled on the wet sheet. She'd learned to read danger in the set of a man's shoulders, the way he held his reins. This one made her stomach tight. "Morning, ma'am," he called out, touching his hat brim. "This the Rowan place?" "It is," Ruth answered, keeping her voice steady. No sense pretending otherwise when the name was burned into the fence post right beside him. "Caleb around?" "Out with the cattle, back by noon, most likely." The stranger nodded, but made no move to leave. Instead, he studied her with eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. Ruth forced herself to continue hanging wash, though her fingers trembled slightly on the clothespins. "You'd be the housekeeper, then," he said finally. It wasn't quite a question. I work here, yes. Funny thing. He shifted in his saddle, leather creaking. Woman up in Cedar Falls was talking about a gal who used to work at the railway station 2 towns over. Said she up and disappeared last December, right after some trouble with a family. Their little girl took sick and died. Parents blamed the woman who was tending her. Ruth's throat went dry, but she kept her hands moving. Shirt, clothespin, neck shirt. That's unfortunate. Indeed it is. Even more unfortunate. The woman ran off with some of the family's belongings. Or so they say. He leaned forward slightly. This woman, she had dark hair, about your height, went by the name Ruth. The wind gusted, snapping the wet clothes like flags. Ruth turned to face him fully. Chin up. Common name, Ruth. True enough. The stranger smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Still, thought I'd mention it. The family name of Morrison, they're still powerful angry. Might pay well for information about where she went. Can't help you, Ruth said flatly. Can't or won't. Before she could answer, the sound of hoofbeats announced Caleb's early return. He rode in at an easy pace, but Ruth saw how his posture changed when he spotted the stranger. By the time he reached them, his hand rested casual-like near his rifle scabbard. Help you with something? Caleb's voice was mild, but there was steel underneath. The stranger straightened. Just passing through, asking your woman here about someone I'm looking for. My employee, Caleb corrected. And something in how he said it made the stranger's smile falter. And if she says she can't help you, then that's that. Now, friend, no need for... I'm not your friend. Caleb moved his horse between the stranger and Ruth. And visiting hours are over. Road's that way. The 2 men stared at each other for a long moment. Then the stranger shrugged. All easy manners again. No offense meant, just doing a job. But if you do hear anything about Ruth Carson, that's the woman I'm looking for. Folks in Cedar Falls would surely like to know. He tipped his hat and rode off, taking his time about it. Caleb sat watching until the horse and rider disappeared over the rise. Only then did he dismount. That your trouble? He asked quietly. Ruth found her voice. Yes, maybe, I don't know. This family he mentioned, the Morrisons, their girl died. Ruth nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. Pneumonia. I was governess and nurse help. She was 5, sweet child, but frail. When the fever came... She stopped, swallowed hard. I did everything I could, sat with her day and night, but she was too weak, and the doctor came too late, and... They blamed you. Her mother was wild with grief. Said I must have done something wrong, given her the wrong medicine. Let her get chilled. Then, when they found some of their silver missing, Ruth's voice broke. I never took anything, but one of the other servants had been stealing, and when they discovered it after I'd gone... They put it on you, Caleb finished. Easier to blame the one who ran. I shouldn't have run. The words came out in a rush. But Mrs. Morrison, she said she'd see me hanged for murder. And Mr. Morrison, he had connections, influence. I thought I was scared. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the wash basket. Come inside. That laundry can wait. In the kitchen, he poured coffee while Ruth sat at the table, hands clenched in her lap. Her mind was already calculating how long it would take to pack, how far she could get before dark, whether she had enough money saved for stage fare. You planning to run again? Caleb asked, reading her thoughts. I won't bring trouble to your door. You've been kind. That's not what I asked. Ruth met his eyes. What choice do I have if they're still looking? If they come here? Then they come. Caleb sat down across from her. Ruth, I've lived in this valley near 10 years. Folks here know me. My word carries weight. If I say you're a decent woman who works hard and minds her business, they'll believe it over some stranger's story. You don't know that. I know I'm tired of this house being empty." The words came out sharp, surprising them both. Caleb rubbed his face, looking suddenly exhausted. "I mean, what I'm trying to say is, you've made things better here. Lighter, somehow. I'm not keen to go back to how it was." Ruth stared at him. In all their weeks of careful conversation, this was the most he'd revealed about wanting her to stay. "Besides," he continued, gruff again, "running makes you look guilty. Standing your ground, that takes courage. But it's usually the right choice." That evening, Ruth barely touched her supper. She kept starting at every sound, expecting horses, angry voices, accusations. Caleb pretended not to notice, but he cleaned his rifle after dinner, something he usually did Sundays. When she rose to go to her room, he spoke without looking up from the gun. "Lock's on that door for a reason. Use it. And Ruth, my bedroom door'll be open tonight. Anything sounds wrong, you call out." She nodded, not trusting her voice. In her room, she did pack just the essentials in a small bundle she placed by the door. Not because she planned to run, but because being ready made her feel less trapped. Then she lay fully dressed on the bed, listening to every creak of the house. Somewhere past midnight, she heard Caleb moving around, the soft scrape of a chair being positioned, the distinctive sound of a shotgun being loaded. He was sitting guard, she realized. This man who owed her nothing was losing sleep to watch over her. Ruth rose and opened her door quietly. Caleb sat in the kitchen, chair tilted back where he could see both doors, shotgun across his lap. He looked up when she appeared. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. "Doesn't seem right. You losing sleep over my troubles?" "My choice to make." He gestured to the stove. "Coffee's hot if you want it." She poured 2 cups and sat with him. They didn't talk, just sat watching the windows as snow began to fall again. It was peaceful, despite everything, or maybe because of it the shared vigilance, the unspoken agreement that whatever came, they'd face it together. "Had a horse stolen once," Caleb said suddenly. "Good mare, worth a lot. Tracked the thief to a camp about 10 miles north. Could have shot him, been within my rights. But when I found him, he was just a kid, maybe 16, starving, trying to get somewhere that mattered." "What did you do?" "Gave him a meal and directions to the railroad camp where they were hiring. Told him if I ever saw him again, I'd shoot him on principle." Caleb took a sip of coffee. "Point is, sometimes folks do desperate things for desperate reasons. Doesn't make them bad clear through." Ruth understood what he was offering, not just shelter, but belief in her version of events. Trust, freely given. "Thank you," she whispered. "Nothing to thank me for, just common sense." But they both knew it was more than that. It was a choice to stand with her against whatever might come, in a world that had shown her mostly closed doors and suspicious faces. Caleb Rowan was offering something she'd almost forgotten existed, the benefit of the doubt. They sat through the rest of the night, watching snow erase the stranger's tracks, covering the evidence of the day's threat. By dawn, the world was clean and white again, like a fresh page waiting to be written. "Get some sleep," Caleb said as gray light filled the windows. "I'll handle the morning chores." "I'm not tired," Ruth lied. "Neither am I," he lied back. "But no sense both of us being useless today. Go on." Ruth rose, touched his shoulder briefly the first time she'd voluntarily touched him. "I won't run. Whatever comes, I'll face it here." Caleb nodded, placing his work-worn hand over hers for just a moment. "I know." She went to her room then, unpacked her small bundle, and finally slept. When she woke hours later, the sun was high and the kitchen smelled of bacon. Caleb had breakfast waiting, and if he looked tired, he also looked settled in some indefinable way. They didn't speak of the stranger again that day, but something had shifted between them. The careful distance they'd maintained had narrowed. They were no longer just employer and housekeeper, but something more complex allies. Perhaps Two people who'd chosen to stop running from their troubles, at least for now. That night, Ruth left a bowl of soup on the porch, as she always did. But this time, she added a prayer for the stranger to lose his way, for the Morrisons to find peace, for this small sanctuary in the Montana Valley to remain undiscovered, and for the first time in months. She prayed for herself too, not for escape or invisibility, but for the courage to stand her ground. Inside, the lamp burned steady in the window, and Caleb Rowan kept watch, a quiet guardian against the darkness. The days that followed the stranger's visit passed with the careful normalcy of two people determined not to let fear rule them. Ruth kept house with the same quiet efficiency, though she found herself glancing at the road more often. Caleb went about his work, but stayed closer to home, finding reasons to check the barn or mend fences within sight of the house. They didn't speak of it, this new vigilance, like so many things between them. It went acknowledged but unspoken. Ruth continued her evening ritual of leaving soup on the porch. Caleb continued reading his almanac by lamplight. But underneath the routine ran a current of waiting, like the pause between lightning and thunder. Spring arrived in fits and starts, typical for Montana. One day warm enough to work without a coat, the next bringing snow flurries that dusted the emerging grass. Ruth threw herself into spring cleaning with particular vigor, as if by ordering the house she could order the larger world beyond its walls. It was while beating rugs in the yard that she first heard Caleb laugh. She'd been wrestling with a particularly heavy rug, trying to drape it over the line. When a gust of wind caught it, the rug wrapped around her like it was alive, and she found herself tangled, batting at wool and cursing under her breath. "Hold still." Caleb's voice came from somewhere outside her wool prison. "You're making it worse." "I'm perfectly capable of." The rug tightened as she struggled. Then she heard it, a low chuckle that built into actual laughter. Not much, and rusty with disuse, but real. Caleb's hands found the edge of the rug and slowly unwound her, his shoulders shaking slightly. When she emerged, hair wild and face flushed, she found him grinning. It transformed his face entirely, erasing years of careful gravity. "You look like an angry cat I once tried to bathe," he said, still smiling. Ruth tried to maintain her dignity, but the absurdity of it caught her. She laughed too, and for a moment they stood in the spring sunshine, just being two people amused by a stubborn rug. "May used to say those rugs were cursed," Caleb said, helping her properly position it for beating. "Swore they moved on their own just to vex her." "Wise woman," Ruth muttered, whacking the rug with perhaps more force than necessary. They worked together after that, Caleb holding while she beat years of dust from the wool. It was companionable work, the kind that didn't need words. But Ruth noticed he stayed even after the rugs were done, helping her carry them back inside. That evening, while she prepared supper, Caleb brought something from the barn, a piece of wood maybe 2 feet long, smooth and pale. "Found this seasoning in the loft," he said, setting it on the table. "Good pine, no knots. May used to do wood burning, made pictures and such. Thought maybe—" He trailed off, suddenly awkward. "Well, it's there if you want it." Ruth touched the smooth wood, understanding the gift for what it was, not just materials, but permission to add something of herself to this house of carefully preserved memory. "I don't know how to wood burn," she admitted, "but I used to do needlework, samplers and such. There's a box of May's threads and fabrics in the storage room. No sense in them sitting unused." "Another offering?" Ruth nodded, throat tight. "Thank you." Caleb shrugged and retreated to his usual chair, but Ruth caught him watching as she ran her fingers over the wood's grain, already imagining what might be made from it. Days passed in this new ease. They talked more over meals, nothing profound. Just the small observations that make up a life. Caleb mentioned the mare was likely to foal soon. Ruth reported on the garden plot she'd cleared behind the kitchen. He showed her how to mend harness leather. She taught him her trick for keeping bread from burning on the bottom. One evening, Ruth found the courage to ask about the locked room. "I don't mean to pry," she said carefully, "but when I'm cleaning, I wonder, should I be doing something about that room, airing it out, checking for mice?" Caleb was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, it was Elsie's room. Haven't opened it since after. Keep meaning to, but somehow. "It can wait," Ruth said quickly. "No rush." "No," Caleb said slowly. "Maybe it's time. Not to change anything. Just, May would hate thinking of mice getting into Elsie's things." They went together the next morning. Caleb's hand shook slightly as he turned the key. The door opened on a room frozen in time, a small bed with a quilt covered in embroidered butterflies, shelves of toys and books, a rocking chair in the corner. Dust motes danced in the light from the window, but otherwise it might have been waiting for a child to return from playing. Ruth stood back, letting Caleb enter first. He moved slowly, touching things with careful fingers, the carved wooden animals on the shelf, a doll's cradle complete with tiny quilts, a picture book left open on the floor. "She was learning her letters," he said, voice rough. "May was teaching her. See, she copied them here." He showed Ruth a slate with wavering letters traced in chalk. "Elsie" spelled out in a 4-year-old's determined hand. They worked in respectful silence, Ruth following Caleb's lead. She cleaned surfaces while he made decisions what stayed exactly as it was, what could be carefully packed away. Some toys went into a trunk for keeping, others stayed on shelves. The butterfly quilt was aired and replaced exactly as it had been. When they found Elsie's church dress in the wardrobe, tiny and perfect with its lace collar, Caleb's composure finally cracked. He sat heavy in the rocking chair, the small dress across his knees, shoulders shaking with silent grief. Ruth knelt beside the chair, not touching, just present. After a moment, she began to speak softly. "Samuel had a Sunday shirt I made special, blue, because he loved blue everything. After he died, I carried that shirt with me everywhere, slept with it under my pillow, wore it out with handling until it was more whole than cloth." She paused. "The day I had to leave it behind felt like losing him all over again. But you know what I realized?" Caleb looked at her, eyes wet. "The love I put into making that shirt, the love he felt wearing it that didn't go anywhere, it's still here." She touched her chest. "The things are just things. It's the love that lasts." Caleb nodded slowly. They stayed like that a while longer. Two parents in a nursery that would never again hear a child's laughter. But when they finally left, locking the door behind them, something had eased. The room was still a shrine, but now it was a clean shrine, tended with love rather than abandoned to grief. That night after supper, Caleb brought out a wooden box Ruth hadn't seen before. "May saved Elsie's drawings," he said, opening it. Thought you might like to see who she was." They spread the papers on the table, childish drawings of horses with too many legs, trees that looked like lollipops, stick figures labeled Mama and Papa in wavering letters. One showed a house with smoke curling from the chimney and 3 figures holding hands in front, one tall, one medium, one tiny. "That's us," Caleb said unnecessarily. "She gave it to me for my birthday. Said it was so I'd remember what home looked like if I ever got lost." Ruth studied the drawing, seeing the care in each crooked line. "She loved you both so much. It shows in every picture." "She was easy to love," Caleb said simply. "All heart, that one, like her mother." They put the drawings away carefully, but the warmth of sharing them lingered. When Ruth rose to clear the table, Caleb caught her hand briefly. "Thank you," he said, "for today, for understanding about the room, he struggled for words, for bringing life back to this place." Ruth squeezed his hand gently. "We're both finding our way back to life, I think." He nodded, released her hand, but the connection remained, invisible and strong as thread between them. That night, Ruth worked on a sampler using May's embroidery threads. She'd found good fabric in the sewing box, and her fingers remembered the old patterns as she worked. She thought about the butterfly quilt in Elsie's room, the careful stitches that spoke of a mother's love. Her own stitches joined that continuum women across time, creating beauty for those they loved. Across the room, Caleb read his almanac, but she caught him watching her work. The lamplight made a circle of gold around them, holding back the darkness, and for the first time since she'd arrived, the house felt not like a memorial, but like what it had always been meant to be, a home. "What are you making?" Caleb asked eventually. Ruth held up the sampler, just beginning, but the pattern emerging. "A blessing for the house, where love abides and friendship is a guest." My grandmother used to say that. "It's good," Caleb said. "This house could use more blessings." They sat in comfortable quiet after that, Ruth's needle flashing in the lamplight, Caleb turning pages he probably wasn't really reading. Outside, the spring wind played around the corners of the house, and somewhere in the darkness an owl called. But inside was warmth and light, and the fragile beginning of something neither quite dared name. The spring melt had come early that year, turning the ground behind the kitchen into workable soil by late March. Ruth stood with her hands on her hips, surveying the patch she'd claimed for a garden. It wasn't much, maybe 20 feet square, but it was enough for vegetables and a few flowers if she planned carefully. She'd been pulling weeds and turning earth all morning, finding satisfaction in the honest work of preparing soil for planting. The sun was warm on her back, and she'd removed her shawl, working in just her everyday dress with the sleeves rolled up. It felt good to be creating something new, something that wasn't about maintaining the past but building toward future seasons. That's when she found it, tangled in the roots of an old rose bush she was trying to save. At first she thought it was just a piece of cloth, but as she carefully worked it free, she realized it was a handkerchief, once white, now stained with an earth and time. But the corner embroidery was still visible, May R, in silver thread so fine and careful it must have taken hours to complete. Ruth sat back on her heels, holding the delicate thing in her dirt-stained hands. The stitching was exquisite, the kind of work that spoke of patience and skill and pride in the making. She could picture May sitting by lamplight, creating this small beauty with needle and thread, perhaps while Caleb read his almanac and Elsie played at her feet. She should bury it again, Ruth thought, let it rest where it had fallen. But something in her couldn't bear to return such careful work to the earth. Instead, she rinsed it gently at the pump, watching years of dirt wash away to reveal ivory linen gone soft with age. The silver thread still gleamed, proud and bright against the fabric. Ruth laid it on the porch rail to dry in the sun and returned to her gardening. But her mind kept returning to that handkerchief, to the woman who'd made it, to all the small beauties that get lost when a life ends too soon. By afternoon, she'd cleared the entire plot and discovered more remnants of May's garden, the skeleton of what had been a substantial herb patch, several rose bushes that might bloom again with care, and neat rows of stones that must have once bordered flower beds. It was like archaeology, uncovering the shape of a previous life through its remaining traces. When Caleb came in from checking the cattle, he found her kneeling by the recovered herb garden, trying to identify what might still be viable. "That's rosemary," he said, pointing to a woody shrub she'd been puzzling over. "May brought it from her mother's garden in Nebraska. Surprised it survived." "Hardy plants, rosemary," Ruth said, "like the women who grow them." Caleb made that sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was learning to be one. May would have liked that. She always said herbs remember their purpose even when people forget. He helped her identify the rest sage, thyme, a struggling lavender plant that might revive with attention. They worked together as the afternoon wore on, Caleb sharing memories as they came how May had insisted on planting vegetables in neat rows like soldiers, how she'd talked to the plants like they were children needing encouragement, how she'd made Elsie a crown of roses for her 4th birthday. "Found something else," Ruth said eventually, retrieving the handkerchief from the porch. "It was tangled in the rose roots." Caleb took it with careful hands, running his thumb over the embroidered initials. Her mother made this for her wedding gift, part of a set dozen handkerchiefs, each with different flowers embroidered on them. May carried this one everywhere. He was quiet for a moment, wondered where it had gone. "You should keep it," Ruth said, but Caleb was already pressing it back into her hands. "No," he said firmly. "You found it. You saved it. Maybe it was meant for you to find." Ruth looked down at the delicate thing, this remnant of another woman's life now resting in her palm. "I'll take good care of it. I know you will." They finished the garden work as the sun lowered, planning where the vegetables would go, which flowers might thrive in the Montana soil. It felt hopeful, this planning for growth, for harvest, for seasons yet to come. That evening, Ruth made cornbread with the last of the winter cornmeal, and they ate it warm with butter and honey while discussing seed orders and planting schedules. The handkerchief lay folded on the shelf by the window, catching the lamplight. "I want to plant sunflowers," Ruth said suddenly. "Along the fence, like—" She stopped, not wanting to presume. "Like Elsie did," Caleb finished. "Yes, they should grow there again." After supper, Ruth brought out the sampler she'd been working on. She'd made good progress, the words taking shape in neat cross-stitch, where love abides and friendship is a guest. But tonight, looking at May's handkerchief with its exquisite embroidery, her own work seemed clumsy, inadequate. "What's wrong?" Caleb asked, noticing her frown. "May's needlework," Ruth said, gesturing to the handkerchief. "It's so fine, so perfect. Mine looks like a child's work in comparison." Caleb set down his almanac and really looked at her sampler. "Different isn't worse," he said finally. May learned from her mother, who learned from hers generations of women passing down stitches like recipes. "Your work tells a different story, that's all." "What story does it tell?" Ruth asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. He considered determination, making something beautiful even when life's been hard, hope for better days. He pointed to a section where she'd had to pull out and redo stitches. "See there, you could have left it be, but you fixed it, made it right. That tells me something about who you are." Ruth felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected insight. "Thank you." "Just truth," Caleb said, returning to his reading, but she caught the small smile on his face. She worked on the sampler with renewed purpose, understanding now that it didn't have to be perfect to be valuable, like the garden taking shape outside, like the friendship growing between them. It was the intention that mattered, the daily choice to create rather than destroy. Later, as she prepared for bed, Ruth carefully pressed May's handkerchief between 2 clean cloths and placed it in her small trunk of possessions. But first, she held it to the lamplight one more time, studying those careful stitches, that patient work of hands now stilled. "Thank you," she whispered, though whether to May or to Providence or to the spring earth that had preserved this small treasure, she couldn't say. The next morning dawned clear and perfect for planting. Caleb had business in town, but promised to bring back seeds. Ruth spent the morning preparing the garden beds, working compost into the soil, creating neat furrows for future plantings. She was taking a break, sitting on the porch steps with a cup of water, when she noticed the first green shoots pushing through the earth along the fence line. She went to investigate and found them sunflower volunteers, seeds that had waited all these years for someone to clear the weeds and let the sun reach the soil again. Ruth knelt beside them, touching the brave green shoots gently, life persisting despite loss, beauty returning when given half a chance. She thought of Elsie planting the original flowers, of May watching from this very porch, of all the seasons that had passed since then. And now here was Ruth, continuing the cycle, tending growth in soil enriched by memory. When Caleb returned from town, wagon loaded with seed packets and planting supplies, he found her there by the fence, carefully clearing space around the volunteer sunflowers. "They came back," she said, looking up at him with wonder. "Some things do," he said softly. "When the conditions are right." They unloaded the wagon to gather packets of beans and corn and squash, tomato starts wrapped in damp newspaper, herb seedlings that would join the survivors in May's old garden, but also flower seeds, marigolds and zinnias and cosmos, chosen for hardiness but also for the simple joy of color. "Thought the place could use more flowers," Caleb said, almost defensive. May always said a garden without flowers was like a day without laughter. "She was right," Ruth said, holding the packets like treasure. "We'll make it beautiful again." They worked until sunset, planting the hardiest vegetables, setting out markers for future plantings, watering everything with careful attention. It was good work, hopeful work, the kind that connected them to the earth and to each other and to all the gardeners who'd come before. That night, Ruth added May's initials to her sampler, a small tribute worked in silver thread in the corner, not copying May's style, but honoring it, acknowledging the continuum of women who'd made this house a home. When she showed Caleb, he nodded once, understanding without words. "It's right," he said simply, "past and present together." And it was right, Ruth thought, as she prepared for bed, the handkerchief in her trunk, the volunteer sunflowers by the fence, the new garden rising from old ground, all of it spoke of continuation rather than ending, of life persistent and renewable as spring itself. Tomorrow she would plant more seeds, tend the green things reaching towards sun, but tonight she fell asleep thinking of silver thread and patient hands, of stories told in stitches and soil, of the strange and precious ways the past makes room for the future. They came at dusk, when the sky was caught between day and night and shadows made everything uncertain. Ruth was in the garden, tying up the young tomato plants that had grown faster than expected, when she heard the horses, multiple horses, moving with purpose rather than the easy gait of travelers. Her hands stilled on the twine. Through the kitchen window, she saw Caleb set down his coffee cup and rise slowly. He'd heard them too. By the time the riders reached the gate, Caleb was on the porch, rifle held casual but ready. Ruth stayed in the garden shadows, recognizing the man in front, Morrison himself, the father of the child who'd died. Behind him rode the stranger from weeks ago, and another man she didn't know. "Evening, Rowan," Morrison said. His voice carried the confidence of money and influence, even here in the Montana Valley. "I believe you're harboring someone who belongs to me." "Don't recall owning people being legal anymore," Caleb replied evenly. "War settled that question." Morrison's face darkened. "Don't play games. The woman calling herself Ruth Marin is wanted for theft and—" He paused. "Other matters. I've come to collect her. Man comes to my door making accusations. I expect to see proof." Caleb hadn't moved, but somehow he seemed to fill more space on the porch. "You got papers, warrant sheriff, with you?" "I don't need—" "Yes, you do." Caleb cut him off. "This is my land. Anyone on it is under my protection unless the law says otherwise. You got legal papers? Let's see them. Otherwise, you're just three men making noise at supper time." The stranger from before spoke up. "Now see here, we tracked her fair." "You tracked someone. Could be anyone. Common enough name. Ruth. Common enough look. Two dark-haired women aren't exactly rare." Morrison leaned forward in his saddle. "I know she's here, and I know she took silver from my house after letting my daughter die through negligence." That's when Ruth stepped out of the shadows. She couldn't let Caleb fight this battle alone, not when it wasn't his to fight. "I took nothing," she said clearly, walking to stand at the porch steps. "And I loved Clara like she was my own. I held her through 3 nights of fever, gave her every medicine the doctor prescribed, prayed until my voice gave out." Morrison's face crumpled for just a moment at his daughter's name, then hardened again. You ran. Innocent people don't run. Frightened people run, Ruth replied. Your wife said she'd see me hanged. What would you have done? You should have. What stayed to be blamed for God's will waited for you to need someone to punish for your pain. Ruth's voice stayed steady, though her hands shook. I'm sorry Clara died. Sorrier than you'll ever know. But I didn't cause it, and I won't be made a scapegoat for tragedy. The third man, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. The silver's still missing. Check with your stable hand, Tom Garrett. Ruth said. He'd been helping himself to small things for months. I caught him once with Mrs. Morrison's brush set, but he swore he was only polishing it. She met Morrison's eyes. I never said anything because Clara loved him. He'd lift her onto the ponies. I didn't want to take that from her. Morrison's face showed the first crack of uncertainty. Tom left our employ right after you did. Convenient timing, Caleb observed dryly. The silence stretched taut. Then Morrison straightened in his saddle. Even if the theft charges are questionable, there's still the matter of negligence. My daughter died in her care. Children die, Caleb said, and his voice carried a weight that made Morrison flinch. They die despite love, despite care, despite everything we do to save them. My own daughter died of fever 4 years back. You want to blame someone, blame God, blame fate, but don't blame the woman who tried to save her. Ruth saw Morrison absorb this, that Caleb too had lost a child, that he spoke from the same well of grief. You don't understand, Morrison began, but Caleb cut him off. I understand perfect. I understand wanting someone to pay for pain that feels too big to carry alone. I understand needing a target for rage that's got nowhere useful to go. He stepped down from the porch, still holding the rifle easy. But I also understand that destroying someone else won't bring your girl back, just makes more misery in a world that's got plenty already. Morrison's companions shifted restlessly, clearly uncomfortable with how this was playing out. The stranger muttered something about legal channels, proper authorities. Here's what's going to happen. Caleb continued. You're going to turn around and ride out. If you want to pursue this through proper law, you do that. Sheriff knows where to find us. But you don't come here again with threats and accusations. You don't come here at all unless you've got a badge or papers saying you can. You'd stake your reputation on this woman, Morrison demanded. I would. Caleb's answer came without hesitation. Ruth Marin works hard, lives honest, and helps where she can. That's all I need to know. All anyone should need. Morrison looked between them, Caleb solid and unmovable. Ruth standing straight despite her fear. Something shifted in his expression, grief overtaking anger for just a moment. Clara talked about you, he said to Ruth, his voice different now, rougher. Said you made up stories about fairy kingdoms in the garden. Said you let her help with your sewing even though she pricked her fingers. She was bright as a penny, Ruth said softly. Curious about everything. The day before the fever came, we pressed flowers to make bookmarks for Christmas gifts. Her voice caught. I still have one she made, violets and baby's breath. Morrison closed his eyes, swayed slightly in his saddle. When he opened them again, some of the hardness had gone. Tom Garrett, he said to his companions. We'll check about Tom Garrett. He turned his horse without another word. The others followed, though the stranger shot one last speculative look back. They rode away as shadows deepened into true night, leaving Caleb and Ruth standing in the yard. When the hoofbeats faded, Ruth's knees gave out. She sat hard on the porch steps, shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. Caleb sat beside her, rifle across his knees. Thank you, she whispered. Nothing to thank me for. You risked everything, your reputation, your standing in the community. Ruth, he turned to look at her directly. A man who won't stand up for what's right when it matters isn't worth much. May knew that about me. It's probably the only reason she said yes when I asked her to marry me, knew I'd fight for her if needed. I'm not May, Ruth said quietly. No, Caleb agreed. You're Ruth, and that's enough. More than enough. They sat as full dark settled around them. Inside, the lamp needed lighting. Supper needed cooking. The normal rhythms of evening waited. But for now, they just sat. Two people who'd faced down threat together and come through the other side. Will they come back? Ruth asked eventually. Maybe, but I doubt it. Morrison's grieving, not evil. Once he checks on Tom Garrett, finds out the truth, he'll be too ashamed to show his face here again. And if you're wrong, Caleb stood, offered her his hand to rise. Then we face it when it comes, together. Ruth took his hand, let him pull her to her feet. For a moment they stood close, her hand still in his. Then propriety reasserted itself and they stepped apart, but the promise lingered together. Inside, Ruth lit the lamp while Caleb secured the rifle. She made a simple supper, beans and cornbread, nothing fancy. They ate quietly, both processing what had happened, what had been said, what it meant for the future. I should tell you, Ruth said as she cleared the plates. About Samuel, about why I was really traveling alone. Only if you want to, Caleb said. I told Morrison the truth. I don't need to know more than I know. But Ruth found she wanted to tell him, wanted someone to know her whole truth. So she talked as she washed dishes, telling him about her husband James, killed in a railroad accident 3 years after Samuel's birth, about trying to make it alone, taking what work she could find, about Samuel's death from fever, so similar to Clara's, so similar to Elsie's. After he died, I couldn't stay in Kansas. Everything reminded me, so I started moving, town to town, job to job. The Morrisons were supposed to be a fresh start. Good family, they said, steady work. She gave a bitter laugh. So much for fresh starts. Maybe you just hadn't gone far enough yet, Caleb said quietly. Maybe Montana was always where you were headed. Ruth turned to look at him, hands still wet from dishwater. Do you believe that in fate, providence, things working out as they're meant to? I didn't, Caleb admitted. For a long time after May and Elsie, I figured God had forgotten this valley entirely. But then you showed up half froze on my doorstep, and things started feeling different. Not fixed, never that, but different, better. I make things better, Ruth had to ask. You make things possible again, Caleb said carefully. Like that garden out there, I walked past that patch of ground every day for 3 years, never thinking to plant anything new. You show up, and suddenly there's vegetables and flowers and those sunflowers coming back. He shrugged. Maybe that's not fate. Maybe that's just what happens when someone who's not done living shows up. Ruth dried her hands slowly, considering his words. We're both still living, she said finally. Just took us a while to remember how. Yeah, Caleb agreed. That's about the size of it. Later, after the evening chores were done and the house was secured for the night, Ruth worked on her sampler while Caleb read, but she noticed he turned few pages, seemed more interested in watching her needle flash in the lamplight. Will you teach me? He asked suddenly. Teach you what? The needlework. Nothing fancy, just might be nice to know how to mend things proper, make things. He looked almost embarrassed. May tried to teach me once, but I was too proud then, thought it was woman's work. And now I think it's just work, useful work, creating instead of just maintaining. So Ruth fetched a piece of practice cloth and a large needle, showed him the basic running stitch. His big fingers were clumsy at first, but he concentrated with the same focus he brought to mending harness or doctoring cattle. Soon he had a row of mostly even stitches marching across the cloth. Not bad, Ruth pronounced. Better than my first attempts, actually. You're being kind. No, she said firmly. I'm being honest. You've got steady hands. That's half the battle. They worked in companionable silence after that, Ruth on her sampler, Caleb practicing his stitches, The lamp burned steady between them, and outside the Montana night was vast and full of stars. But inside was warmth and safety and the quiet pleasure of shared purpose. The Morrison threat might not be over. The stranger might return. The future remained uncertain as always. But tonight, none of that mattered as much as this two people finding their way back to life, one stitch at a time. The smoke woke her first acrid and wrong, not the comfortable smell of wood smoke from the stove. Ruth jolted upright in her narrow bed, instantly alert. Through her small window, she saw an orange glow flickering against the barn wall. Fire! She was out of bed and running before the word fully formed, bare feet slapping against the floor. Caleb, fire in the barn! She heard him moving before she reached his door, the crash of something falling, boots being pulled on. He emerged already dressed, having slept in his clothes as he sometimes did when expecting trouble. Get water buckets from the kitchen, he ordered, already heading for the door. Many as you can carry. Ruth didn't waste time on shoes or proper dress. She grabbed the buckets kept ready by the stove, filled 2 from the water barrel, and ran out into the night. The barn's far wall was already engulfed, flames reaching hungry fingers toward the roof where loose hay would catch like tinder. Caleb had the doors open, leading horses out with grim efficiency. The animals were wild-eyed with fear, fighting him, but he held firm, getting them to safety one by one. Ruth set down the buckets and ran to help, grabbing a lead rope as a panicked mare tried to bolt back toward the burning building. Easy, easy, she crooned, though her own heart was racing. The heat was intense even from here, and she could hear the awful sound of wood cracking, giving way. Together they got the horses out, all 6 of them, including the pregnant mare. Caleb shoved leads into Ruth's hands. Take them to the far pasture. Keep them there. The fire. Can't save the barn. Can maybe save the house. Go. Ruth led the terrified horses away, using every bit of strength to control them. Behind her, she heard Caleb working the pump, filling bucket after bucket. By the time she got the horses secured and ran back, he was soaking the ground between barn and house, creating a fire break. She joined him without words, filling buckets, passing them over, filling again. Her arms ached and her lungs burned from smoke, but she didn't stop. They worked like parts of the same machine, movements synchronized by necessity. The barn roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. Ruth's breath caught, but Caleb just worked faster, wetting down the side of the house, soaking the porch where embers might catch. She followed his lead, throwing water on the chicken coop, the woodshed, anything that might carry fire to the house. Time blurred. Fill, throw, fill, throw. Her bare feet were numb from the cold ground, her nightdress soaked through, but still they worked. The fire roared its fury, consuming years of careful building in minutes. But the firebreak held. The house stood. Finally, when the barn was just a skeleton of glowing timbers against the night sky, Caleb let the bucket fall from his hands. He swayed on his feet, and Ruth caught his arm, steadying him. It's done, he said, voice rough from smoke. Nothing more we can do. They stood watching their work burn, arms supporting each other, too exhausted for words. The barn where Elsie had played, where May had gathered eggs, where generations of animals had sheltered all of it, turning to ash and memory. I'm sorry, Ruth whispered. I'm so sorry. Not your fault, Caleb said. Saw fresh lamp oil on the ground when I opened the doors. This was set deliberate. Ruth's stomach clenched. Morrison. Not his style. That stranger, maybe, or someone hired. Caleb's jaw was tight. Coward's way, burning a man's livelihood in the night. They stayed until the fire burned lower, making sure no stray sparks found new fuel. Dawn was graying the eastern sky when Caleb finally turned away. Come on, you're shivering fit to fall apart. Ruth looked down at herself barefoot, nightdress clinging wet and cold. hands black with soot. She was shivering, though she hadn't noticed until he mentioned it. Caleb didn't look much better. His face streaked with ash, one sleeve of his shirt singed through. Inside, he stoked the stove while she found clean clothes. They moved carefully around each other, both too tired and shocked for modesty to matter much. Ruth heated water, and they took turns washing the worst of the smoke and ash away. Clean and dressed, they sat at the kitchen table with cups of coffee neither really wanted but both needed. Outside the window, the barn continued its slow collapse, each crash making them flinch. "Insurance?" Ruth asked. "Some, not enough to rebuild completely, but enough to get by." Caleb rubbed his face. "Horses are safe. That's what matters most. Rest is just wood and nails." But they both knew it was more than that. It was history burned, memories reduced to char. Ruth reached across the table, covered his soot-stained hand with hers. "We'll rebuild," she said firmly. "Better than before." Caleb turned his hand palm up, laced his fingers through hers. If you'll have me. I know I brought this trouble." "Stop." His grip tightened. "This isn't your fault. And even if it was, even if Morrison himself had lit that fire, I'd rather face it with you than be safe alone." They sat holding hands across the table as full daylight arrived, revealing the extent of the damage. The barn was gone entirely, just blackened timbers and ash. But the house stood. The garden grew. The horses grazed in the far pasture, safe if skittish. "I should go," Ruth said quietly. "Leave before worse comes. You've lost enough." "Try it," Caleb said, just as quiet but firm as iron. "Try leaving. See how far you get before I come after you." "You'd come after me." "Ruth." He looked at her direct, those winter sky eyes holding hers. "I spent 3 years in this house like a ghost, going through motions, pretending that was living. Then you showed up and reminded me what life actually felt like. You think I'd let that go because some coward with a match wants to scare us?" "When you put it like that." Despite everything, Ruth felt a smile tugging at her mouth. "Only way to put it." Caleb squeezed her hand once more, then let go. "Now, we've got work to do. Animals need tending, temporary shelter needs building, and we need to report this to the sheriff." They worked through the day, exhaustion pushed back by necessity. Neighbors arrived as news spread the Hendersons from the next ranch over, the Millers from down valley. Men helped Caleb rig temporary shelter for the horses. Women helped Ruth salvage what could be saved from around the barn ruins. "Shameful thing." "Mrs." Henderson said, sorting through smoke-damaged tack. "Burning a man's barn. What's the world coming to?" "Heard you had visitors yesterday." "Mrs." Miller added, eyes sharp with curiosity. "That Morrison from Cedar Falls." Ruth kept her hands busy, her voice steady. "He was mistaken about some things. Caleb sent him on his way." The women exchanged looks, but didn't press. In the frontier, everyone had things they'd rather not discuss. What mattered was the present, the work that needed doing, the neighbor who needed help. By evening, a rough shelter stood for the horses, and the salvageable items were cleaned and stored. The sheriff had come and gone, taking notes, making promises about investigation that everyone knew would likely come to nothing. Fire was too easy to set, too hard to prove. As the neighbors departed with promises to return tomorrow, Ruth and Caleb found themselves alone again in the kitchen. They were both swaying on their feet, but there was supper to make, animals to tend, life to continue despite disaster. "Sit," Ruth ordered when Caleb reached for his coat. "I'll see to the horses." "Together," he corrected. "We do the work together, or not at all." So they fed and watered the horses together, checked the makeshift shelter, made sure the pregnant mare was calm. They collected eggs from chickens traumatized but unharmed. They moved through evening chores with the wordless coordination of long partnership, though they'd only been sharing labor for months. Back inside, Ruth made simple fair eggs and toasted bread, the last of the apple preserves. They ate in exhausted silence, both too tired to talk but finding comfort in the shared meal, the normal ritual after an abnormal day. "I'll keep watch tonight," Caleb said as they cleared the table. "In case they come back." "Then I'll keep watch with you," Ruth replied. "You need sleep." "So do you. We'll take turns, or watch together. But you're not facing the night alone." Caleb looked at her soot-stained, exhausted, stubbornly brave, and something shifted in his expression. "All right," he said softly. "Together, then." They pulled chairs to the kitchen window where they could see the yard and the still smoldering barn ruins. Ruth brought out her sewing, though her hands were almost too tired to hold the needle. Caleb cleaned his rifle, movements automatic from long practice. "Tell me about rebuilding," Ruth said after a while. "What kind of barn should we put up?" Caleb asked again, but this time with a slight smile. "We," Ruth confirmed. "Unless you're planning to build it alone." "Wouldn't dream of it." He set the rifle aside, leaned back in his chair. "Well, if we're building new, might as well do it right. Bigger tack room, better ventilation, maybe a proper hayloft with a pulley system." They talked through the night, planning a future that assumed partnership, assumed permanence, assumed we. The lamp burned steady between them, holding back more than just darkness. When Caleb's eyes started to close despite himself, Ruth touched his hand. "Sleep an hour. I'll watch. Wake me if anything. I will rest now." He dozed in the chair, head tipped back, exhaustion winning over vigilance. Ruth kept watch, needle moving in steady rhythm, eyes alert for any sign of trouble. But the night stayed quiet except for the occasional crash of timber falling in the barn ruins. When she woke him to take his turn, the eastern sky was beginning to pale. He watched while she dozed, and when full dawn arrived with no further trouble, they both relaxed slightly. "Made it through," Caleb said. "Yes," Ruth agreed, understanding he meant more than just the night. They'd made it through the fire, the threat, the test of whether this fragile thing between them could survive real hardship. The weeks after the fire passed in a blur of work and planning. The community rallied as frontier communities do, men arriving with lumber donations, women bringing food and offers of help. The new barn rose from the ashes of the old, better designed as Caleb had envisioned, with Ruth's suggestions incorporated throughout. It was during this rebuilding that things shifted between them, subtle but undeniable. The careful distance they'd maintained narrowed with each shared task, each decision made together. When Ruth suggested a window in the tack room for better light, Caleb said good idea and added it to the plans. When he proposed moving the doors for easier wagon access, she nodded and said, "That makes sense." They were partners now in everything but name. The sheriff never found who set the fire, but word came through the town grapevine that Morrison had discovered the truth about Tom Garrett found him 3 towns over trying to pawn silver candlesticks. The formal charges against Ruth were dropped, the family too ashamed to pursue anything further. The stranger who'd tracked her vanished like smoke, probably seeking easier quarry. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the completed barn, Caleb cleared his throat in the way that meant he had something important to say. "Been thinking," he began, then stopped. Ruth waited, having learned his rhythms. He'd speak when ready. "That ring in my drawer," he said finally. "May's ring, the iron one from her grandmother. It's been sitting there 3 years, serving no purpose." Ruth's hands stilled on the sewing in her lap. "Seems wrong," Caleb continued. "Keeping useful things from being used, like those boots sitting in storage, or that good fabric waiting to be sewn." He turned to look at her directly. "Or a man and woman living in the same house, working the same land, building the same future, but pretending they're not already family." "Caleb," Ruth's voice came out whisper soft. I'm not a young man anymore. He said, not much for pretty speeches or grand gestures, but I know what works and what doesn't. We work, Ruth. This works. He pulled something from his pocket, the iron ring, simple and worn smooth by generations of wear. If you're willing, if you want, this could be yours. We could make it official, what we already are. Ruth set aside her sewing, took the ring with trembling fingers. It was warm from his pocket, solid and real as the life they'd built together from ashes and determination. I didn't come here looking for this, she said softly. Didn't think I'd ever... Neither did I, Caleb admitted. But here we are. Here we are, Ruth agreed. She slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit as if made for her. Yes, Caleb, yes to all of it. His smile transformed his weathered face, made him look years younger. Don't suppose you want a church wedding with all the fuss? Lord, no. Ruth laughed. Unless you do. Just thought I should offer. May wanted all the trimmings, and she deserved them. But this, he gestured between them. At the rebuilt barn, the thriving garden, the life they'd cultivated. This feels like it needs something simpler. Judge Carter could marry us at the courthouse, Ruth suggested. Quiet and legal. Next week when I take the wheat to market. That would suit me fine. They sat in comfortable silence as stars began to appear. Ruth looked at the ring on her finger. This circle of continuity that had witnessed who knew how many promises, how many lives built together against the odds. I won't try to be May, she said quietly. Won't try to fill her place exactly. Don't want you to, Caleb replied. May was May. You're Ruth. Room in a life for both. Different times, different ways. He reached over, took her hand. But I promise you this, I'll be as good a husband to you as I know how. Maybe better, because I know now how quick things can change. And I'll be the best wife I can, Ruth promised. We'll build something good here. Caleb, something that lasts. A week later, they stood before Judge Carter in his dusty office, the Hendersons as witnesses. Ruth wore her good dress, the brown wool that had survived all her travels, and Caleb wore his church clothes that still smelled faintly of cedar from storage. They spoke their vows simply, honestly. Two people who'd learned that love could come quietly, built from daily choices and shared work rather than lightning strikes. After, they had dinner at the small restaurant in town, awkward as courting youngsters despite being middle-aged and having shared a house for months. Mrs. Henderson had tears in her eyes as she hugged Ruth goodbye. It's good to see that house living again, she said. May would be glad. The ride home was quiet, both adjusting to the shift from arrangement to marriage. But when they reached the ranch and Caleb helped Ruth down from the wagon, he held her hand a moment longer than necessary. Welcome home, Mrs. Rowan, he said softly. I've been home for months, Ruth replied. Now it's just official. That night, Caleb moved his things to the main bedroom, their bedroom now. It was awkward at first. Two people used to solitude learning to share space. But when Ruth woke in the dark hours, disoriented by the unfamiliar warmth beside her, Caleb's hand found hers. Just me, he murmured. Go back to sleep. She did, feeling safer than she had in years. The seasons turned, as seasons do. The garden Ruth planted grew lush, the sunflowers towering over the fence just as Elsie's once had. The new barn filled with hay and horses and the comfortable sounds of a working ranch. Ruth's sampler hung finished on the parlor wall, where love abides and friendship is a guest, with Emmer and R, worked in small letters at the bottom, past and present, acknowledged together. On a cold December evening, snow falling soft outside, Ruth told Caleb she had news. They were sitting by the fire, her knitting needles clicking, his hands working on a new piece of harness. Spring will be busier than usual, she said carefully. We'll have extra work come May or thereabouts. Caleb looked up from the leather. New calves always mean extra work. Not calves, Ruth said, meeting his eyes. A baby. Caleb, we're going to have a baby. The harness slipped from his hands. He stared at her, a dozen emotions crossing his face: shock, fear, joy, terror, wonder. You're sure? Sure as a woman can be. I saw Doc Miller yesterday when I went to town for supplies. A baby, Caleb repeated, like he was tasting the word. At our age. We're not ancient, Ruth said, trying for lightness, though her own heart was racing. Plenty of women have babies at 35. Men become fathers at 42. That's not what I... He moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands. Are you... Is it safe? After what happened before, Ruth understood his fear they'd both lost children, knew how quickly joy could turn to ash. Doc Miller says I'm healthy, says there's no reason to expect trouble. She squeezed his hands. I'm not May. Caleb, this isn't the same. No, he agreed, voice rough. But I'm still scared. So am I, Ruth admitted. Terrified, but also hopeful. Is that allowed, to be both? I think that's the only way to be, Caleb said. He lifted her hands to his lips, kissed each palm. A baby. Our baby. It won't replace the ones we lost, Ruth said carefully. No, nothing could, but maybe. Caleb's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Maybe this is what comes next. New life after the grieving. Another chance to do it right. Spring came slowly that year, winter holding on with late snows and frost. But Ruth's garden grew anyway, and her belly grew with it. Caleb fussed over her in ways that made her laugh, insisting she'd not lift anything heavier than a dinner plate, watching her like she might shatter. The neighbor women smiled knowingly and brought baby clothes saved from their own children. On a warm May morning, with wildflowers blooming across the valley and the rebuilt barn casting its shadow over ground that had known such sorrow, Ruth gave birth to a daughter. She was small but strong, with lungs that announced her arrival to the world. What should we call her? Caleb asked, holding the baby like she was made of spun glass. Ruth thought of all the names that mattered: May, Elsie, Samuel. But this child deserved her own name, her own story. Hope, she said finally. Hope Elizabeth Rowan. Hope, Caleb repeated, and his smile was wonder itself. That's perfect. That evening, as Ruth dozed with the baby at her breast and Caleb kept watch from the chair beside the bed, the lamp burned steady in the window. It had guided Ruth to safety on a frozen night. It had burned through danger and loss and the slow journey back to life. Now it welcomed a new soul to this house that had known such sorrow and found its way to joy again. You're home now, Caleb whispered to his daughter, echoing words that had been spoken before, would be spoken again. You're safe, you're loved, you're home. And in the Montana Valley, where the mountains stood eternal and the seasons turned their ancient wheel, a family began again. Not replacing what was lost, nothing could do that, but building something new from the ashes of the old, stronger for having been tested, beautiful for having been broken and mended with gold threads of love and time and hope. The lamp burned on, steady as a heartbeat, steady as a promise kept. Thank you so much for listening to this story of love, loss, and new beginnings in the Old West. I hope Ruth and Caleb's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine while sharing it with you. I'd love to hear where you're listening from, whether it's a bustling city or a quiet valley like Caleb's Montana Ranch. Please share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's connect over our shared love of these frontier tales. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 and hit the like button to help more people discover these tales of the American frontier. And don't forget to click that hype button. Your support helps these stories reach even more listeners who appreciate authentic Western narratives. Until next time, partners, keep riding toward the sunset.